Hey there, welcome to Spectrum Pulse, where we talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today it's a big one, the newest project from The Weeknd, Hurry Up Tomorrow. There are a number of ways in which I could start this review, but I don't think any of them are all that satisfying. I mean, the most obvious is to highlight that The Weeknd has said this will be his last album under that moniker, which prompts folks to think about his run across the 2010s and early 2020s, carving out an extremely respectable run across the charts and popular culture, even if I would struggle to call any one project truly transcendent. Although at this point, as one of the few who thinks that Thursday is the best thing he ever did, with my favorite songs outside of that project being Blinding Lights, Out of Time, False Alarm, and 6 Feet Under, I'm not that sure my opinion is all that representative of anyone. Now, you could also highlight that it's the end of a trilogy that started with After Hours, a thematic arc that started with existential collapse, followed by the purgatory of Dawn FM, that would eventually lead to some form of heaven on the other side. You know, the Divine Comedy, but with cocaine and hookers this time. But the larger story might be something even uglier. How even among the very short list of acts where the final installment in the trilogy might stick the landing or wind up the weakest of the three, this was looking to be a possible disaster. And I don't blame The Weeknd for all of it. He couldn't have possibly known how much resonance the best songs of After Hours would have, along with the widespread critical and commercial acclaim of its years that went completely to hell, and then the overlapping but kind of middling run of Dawn FM in 2022, beaten on the charts by a Gunna album that the majority of you have already forgotten, but with multiple singles underperforming along the way nonetheless. And it would leave anything coming in next in an uncertain place. If only it was just that. Putting aside an unfortunate concert in SoFi Stadium in Los Angeles that he had to cancel midway through as his voice started giving out, there was The Idol, a Sam Levinson-helmed catastrophe disguised as a TV show that was not provocative or interesting enough to be good exploitation, and way too sleazy to be remotely likable, and where it seemed like any veneer The Weeknd had constructed just collapsed in real time, even if he was intentionally self-aware about some of that. Now, the behind-the-scenes drama and weak defenses he made on social media, that was bad enough, but it seemed like this was a moment where an entire audience decided they were about done with one of the biggest pop R&B acts of the previous decade and calling him a squeaky-voiced sleazeball who couldn't act or back up the vast majority of shit that he talked, and whose angst might be more self-serving, self-aggrandizing, and even if that was the underlying point, was the art good enough for enough people to actually care? Now, if you're thinking that all of what I said is somewhat unfair or harsh, well, in my opinion, it's only about half right. The artist is often the last to know when they are cold, and Dawn FM should have been a clue, but truth be told, I'd rather judge The Weeknd on his perennially inconsistent output since the very jump, instead of the fickle population that's deciding to throw him overboard. I think my bigger disconnect from that group, beyond the eternally subjective, well, he just stopped being good, was that he stopped being cool. Because I have never considered The Weeknd all that cool, so much as a preening goth R&B music nerd who occasionally skids into cocaine-infused sex jams and nightmare fuel. As much as he idolizes Prince, he's never had that unshakable charisma or mystique, and for me, that was actually a huge part of his charm, the adrenaline rush of getting pulled along for the dark ride along with him. And yet all of this left Hurry Up Tomorrow in a profoundly uncertain place. Set up as a grand finale, but with less coherent direction than seemingly ever, featuring a lead-up that I would not include in his top 10 best singles, let alone his larger catalog. And you know what? It seemed like the public largely agreed, and it translated to what appeared like a weird lack of confidence. The lead-off single, Dancing in the Flames, getting thrown off the album, in retrospect probably better for it, the art changing into a picture that doesn't really match the rest of the trilogy and has him kind of look a little constipated, the nightmarish confusion around the track list that kept changing, and of course, it all got stretched out to his longest album to date. If you can't tell by now, I had very low expectations. What do we get? Well, this is gonna sound kind of odd, but we got exactly kind of what we expected with this album. It is the culmination of the trilogy, the final album in an arc of intense introspection, where there are both reflections on the Weeknd's sounds from the past, but also this desperate reach for something huge, constantly straining for that bombastic transcendence. It feels accessible and stadium ready, immense to the near breaking point, the sort of album designed to crush out everything in its path, but it's also in moments one of the Weeknd's most truly vulnerable albums in years, disposing of much of his slick pop star cool and structure for something more idiosyncratic, with a lot of meta commentary on the weight of trying to carry all of this as an artist. So much of After Hours and Dawn FM, especially in the music videos and framing, they were about the twisted nightmare of fame and being an artist among all that, but this is the moment where it came closest to actually breaking him. And I say all that to also add that I don't think this album is close to great. At many points I would struggle to even call it good, where all of the Weeknd's grand, ambitious trappings feel increasingly hollow, collapsing inward to highlight how little there was holding the artifice together, where the style finally can't outweigh that lack of substance. And I think we have to start off with compositions and structure, because by the time this album locks into the extended midsection, not only does it start feeling crushingly long, 84 minutes in total, but any sense of momentum just evaporates. Yeah, the Weeknd's still a potent singer, although you can tell he's intensely haunted by some of the concert moments where he had lost his voice, and how his lifestyle has taken a toll on his body as a singer that matters. And I can't deny that the grandiose walls of synth that Mike Dean and Daniel Louboutin of One-Tricks Point Never bringing to the table, it's impressive, drawing direct parallels to the 1980s and the gleaming intensity, but compared to the smoother transitional tones of Dawn FM, this recalls the era of 80s synth pop that felt gothic or alien, and that kind of makes sense for an album attempting to evoke such biblical weight and sound as expensive and opulent as possible. And if you didn't think that was intentional, the opening track, Wake Me Up, it's interpolating Michael Jackson's Thriller with one of the few solid bass lines on this album, and then sampling the theme from Scarface. You don't shell out that kind of money, especially to get Giorgio Moroder again for Big Sleep, if you're not trying to evoke that immense power, even if I'm still wishing that Alangelo could be here to add a little bit more grime to all the searing polish. But all of the opulent synthesizers in the world can't really help you if the groove is just not there, and this is the first huge problem with Hurry Up Tomorrow. Without that underlying groove, more of a foundation, the mid-tempo section after the bassy and shuddering gothic love song Open Hearts not only seems to go on forever, but the melodic modulations are just not really here to help them individual songs shine through, switch up the vibe. It starts running together really fast, especially when the crescendos are hitting the same ascending progression matched by the vocal line, and many of the songs are running long. Now this is where I'm looking at the production team with a lot of questions. It annoys me personally that The Weeknd hasn't worked with Alangelo since After Hours, when he could add some tangible grit to all the sleaze, I'll say it again. But in theory, One-Tricks Point Never and Mike Dean, they make sense to evoke that sense of scale. They've done it before. But when the trap-inflected percussion is so blocky and heavy, but also paradoxically brittle, and the synths are blaring at full volume, you lose some of that sense of contrast, and it winds up getting lost in its own grandiosity. If we're already talking about Scarface, the lesson here is not to get high on your own supply. I mean, thank God Metro Boomin shows up a couple of times. He gives some propulsive gloss to Giving Up on Me before the song kind of decomposes into a washed-out, meandering piano. He's considerably less successful with a very petulant Cry For Me, which should absolutely not be a single, in the same way that the groove of Timeless from Pharrell sounds like it's falling over itself, and Playboi Carti once again contributes very little worth caring about. And it reminds me of The Weeknd's worst production instincts that I mentioned way back when I reviewed Dawn FM, and they're way more prominent here, where in embracing these frigid dance bangers, any sort of sensuality feels jettisoned, tossed out the window, and where sounding big becomes more important than decent compositional foundation and structure, and these songs well, let's hope they can wind up memorable. I mean, you'd think after Kissland over a decade ago, he would have learned and fixed that. And that's not saying every sonic choice is a misstep here. I know that Sao Paolo feels paradoxically like a watered-down Brazilian funk song, but also a shuddering, howling clusterfuck. But I still kind of like how it has a harder edge than the rest of this album, a little bit of grit, and it actually fits in the track listing in capturing the exhausted terror of trying to carry a stadium show so far away from home that you're nearly dead on your feet. It's one of the darkest moments on this album. Then you have the note-perfect 80s melodrama of Take Me Back to LA. That's a really solid melodic echo of Escape from LA from After Hours, the sort of callback to the trilogy that I wish the album did a lot more of to tie it all together, and it flows really well into the grim and gauzy Big Sleep that feels damn near operatic, especially with Giorgio Moroder's talkback vocals. Then Max Martin helps contribute to Give Me Mercy, which is probably the closest parallel to the easy listening tracks of Dawn FM, with some really pretty fizzy synths. And on the flip side, I really like the warped guitars and the flutes that contort across the haunted Reflections Laughing, where his voice plays a little bit deeper into the mix, and Florence Welch punching up the second chorus, even if you can barely hear her. And yet after a very revealing voicemail message, you have Travis Scott playing the pitch-shifted demon of the Weeknd's hedonism and nihilism. Hell, I like Travis here more than when Future shows up for the next song on the Chipmunks sample flip of Enjoy the Show. Another exasperating melodic choice that also pops up a number of times, like the lumbering Niagara Falls and I Can't Wait to Get There, alongside one of the few actual descriptive verses from The Weeknd. But the grinding weediness of the song Fragment Opening Night, probably the weakest song here, the Abyss squandering its fluttery pianos with these flattened buzzes, and some truly egregious vocal production around Lana Del Rey. I got no problem with her actually being there. We'll come back to it. It makes sense given her arc in The Weeknd's career. But man alive, her vocal runs did not work for me on that song. But then you have the squonking synths piling up over Red Terror. Even if I think the album ends on a really strong note with the grimy choral overdubs across Without a Warning, and the inspired powered ballad interpolation of the late David Lynch's song In Heaven, Lady in the Radiator, that comes back from Eraserhead, this project just takes way too goddamn long to get to that payoff, and is it even worth it? But okay, maybe the content is enough to get this album over the finish line, and I honestly don't even know how I can say that with a straight face, especially so many years removed from The Weeknd's most visceral and impactful lyrics, because the other major factor to so many of these songs feeling like they're running together or not that distinct is how, at least on the surface, we've heard this brand of self-flagellating melodrama from him for damn near 15 years. The tortured passive-aggressive romances, the nihilistic wallowing, the drug abuse. Even if I'm gonna give this album's thematic arc way more credit than it probably deserves, I would struggle to say many of these songs have the distinctive lyrical detail to really stand out amidst his larger catalog. And even with some of that context, I'm gonna say it's kind of dicey, because as the final album in the trilogy where the ascent to heaven is the final focus, much of this project is reflecting on legacy, aging, the strain of being a superstar showman who is living way too hard to keep it up forever, where the element of meta commentary and the women he's singing about could well just be his larger relationship with his audience, which might be why we get so little in the way of details describing those women when that did not used to be a problem for him. And the element of performance and that meta element weighs heavily across the project. The worldwide tours, the snide jabs of Opening Night, and the bitter sarcasm of Enjoy the Show. The voicemail clip on Reflections Laughing amidst the purple drink sloshing in his cup, highlighting just how rough he looked on Dallas on stage, which culminates on Giving Up on Me, where he flat out admits the whole redemption arc that he was attempting across After Hours and Dawn FM, it was a failure. He was lying in that moment to his audience, or maybe he's lying on this song because he's awash in depression and trying to drive everybody else away, which makes the following it with the bragging of I Can't Wait to Get There an utter tone killer, made all the worse by Timeless not remotely living up to its title and some of the very dull flexes. I still don't care for that song. And that's where this project starts to really frustrate me, because there is a lot of very dark ideation on this project surrounding one's own end, being honest with one's oneself, setting affairs in order, the sort of material that makes sense in the final arc of a trilogy, and there is understandable insecurity in closing that door on his career, trying something brand new. But it's also an album that wants to have this grand storied legacy, go out on top. And not only does it feel somewhat unconvincing given how much the project feels shaped by recent events, so he's not very much on top, the tone of the melodrama starts to sour. I want to buy into the Weeknd's thoughts of family on the final third, the feel of having a tainted legacy that's aged weirdly, and he knows it, where he wants to celebrate the success even as the lifestyle's kind of killing him. And I almost appreciated him admitting on Without a Warning that he says, I should have been sober, but I can't afford to be boring. But it still leads to this hollow feeling that outside of the pure showmanship and your investment in the entertainment of the story, with this sort of cinematic scope, it should feel like there's a little bit more to say. Nothing illustrates that more to me than having Lana Del Rey on this album on the appropriately titled The Abyss. She's been described as the girl that occupies the songs of the Weeknd. And yet, really, how much was all of it worth when the collaborations never felt as special as they should? And she went considerably deeper on her own, especially in her 2023 album, and despite so much more commercial success, The Weeknd feels very caught in place. The aging Lothario who cannot keep it up like he used to. Pun intended. It's also the big reason that if I think anything saves this album, it's the final two songs, especially the closing title track. It's confession, it's acceptance, it's trying to find some level of forgiveness, looking at his family as he looks into the light, get away from so many self-inflicted wounds where he can finally put the Weeknd to bed. And yet the outro is a seamless transition if you wanted to play his debut song High for This from House of Balloons. I don't know, maybe it shows how such cycles can't really be broken, that he'll always go back to those ways, that the redemption's a cruel joke. Or, you know, maybe it's the moment where Abel finds his rapture, and the Weeknd is allowed to live it all out down here, running on the hedonistic delusion that tomorrow never comes, so might as well take what you can, so long as your soul is actually saved. Who knows, could be either. But as a whole, look, if the first comparison that kept coming to my mind when I was putting together this review is Taylor Swift's Reputation, way too long, running on bombast with sharply diminishing returns, especially in trap music, trying and half failing to play every angle in the face of unstable popularity and backlash, substance abuse, way too much meta commentary about one's legacy and reputation. Look, none of those are good signs. Even if I think the album ends well, it's got its moments. It's trying to do so much so broadly that the attempts at this thundering climax feel increasingly hollow. And even if that is somewhat of the point, it could have been done on a project that doesn't feel so goddamn bloated. It feels like a CGI-heavy franchise blockbuster that lands some of the emotional beats, maybe even has some compelling themes if you're looking for them, but the production budget and the weight of continuity leaves you feeling that it all should feel so much more special and memorable than it does. And what do you know, there's actually a movie that's getting a limited release tied to this album. And why do I get the sinking feeling that there's going to be context that the lyrics could have actually used here? And while I respect The Weeknd trying to move past this persona, attempt something very different and new for him, I mean, I genuinely want to hear what that Abel Tesfaye album is going to sound like. Hopefully it doesn't involve that much more acting. We don't need that. I don't know. This is a project that leaves me less sure of that transition than ever before. A lot of possibilities might open up in the meantime, but with this, you know what? It's worth a listen if you got the time for it, but if it doesn't stick around on the charts, The Weeknd might just regret how often he was wishing for that tomorrow, even if at the end of the day, it was probably the right choice. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you want to see more, please be sure to like, share, drop comments, subscribe. Not gonna lie, this was a really tough one to process. There's a lot to get through with this album, and I'm fairly certain this is gonna be a contentious review. Look, folks, I want to like this. I really did, but again, I have weird opinions on The Weeknd, and I have for over a decade. If you guys have any thoughts on that, or you want to argue with me more directly, comments down there, have fun. Beyond that, though, if there's anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. And if you want to help support the channel, maybe get involved in getting albums onto my schedule, yell at me in my Discord, YouTube memberships, Patreon, the options are available. Once again, don't feel obligated, tough times, but again, options available. There you go. Till then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.